So Princess Anne just walked into her nephew's own briefing room and stripped an advisor of every scrap of authority he'd built off one sentence he was never given, and she did it with a single sheet of carbon paper that was never supposed to leave her desk at Gatcombe. And honestly, the detail that keeps pulling me back in isn't the confrontation itself, it's how ordinary the object at the center of it is. Not a will, not a deed, not a hidden account somewhere offshore, a note, a short handwritten warning that Anne wrote to William with her own hand on her own paper, and never meant for anyone else to read at all. Here's the thing about Anne that people forget when they picture her as the brisk, unbothered figure at the edge of every state photograph. She has one habit that's been quietly hers since long before most of the people in that briefing room were born. When something matters enough to put in writing, she writes it by hand on a duplicate pad with a sheet of carbon paper underneath, and she keeps the copy, not because she doesn't trust the person she's writing to, because she's watched over the better part of 6 decades inside this family exactly how easily a private word can turn into somebody else's public claim once it leaves the room. If you've spent any time on this channel, you know the shape of what's coming, a quiet object nobody thought mattered, a claim that doesn't match the behavior underneath it, and a royal who checks the paper trail instead of raising their voice. Here's the thing though, this one has a twist even for this family, because the man who got caught wasn't hiding a scandal from Anne, he was hiding it inside her own words. Let's back up, because that's where the pad of red inked paper actually starts. It's the end of July, and Anne is at Gatcombe Park, her own home in Gloucestershire, the place she's kept as her working base for decades, separate from every palace calendar and every duchy property tied to the rest of the family. Sources describe her at her desk in the small study off the back hallway, the kind of room with worn carpet and a single reading lamp, writing what she considers a private caution to William. He'd been leaning harder and harder over the preceding months on the small transition office set up to help manage the household's longer-term planning, the kind of forward-looking work that royal officers do quietly, years ahead of anything that will ever become public. Anne reportedly had watched that officer's influence grow faster than she thought wise, and she wanted to say so to William directly, not through an aide, not through a meeting, but in her own hand, so there could never be any argument later about what she actually meant. She writes on her red ink pad. It's the color she's used for urgent, personal notes since her days running her own charitable patronages decades ago, a small private signal that says, "Read this one yourself," before anyone else touches it. Underneath the top sheet, as always, sits a carbon duplicate. She writes a handful of sentences, something to the effect that William should verify things himself before letting any single advisor speak on his behalf, that trust is not the same thing as oversight, and that she was saying so out of the plain family concern that comes with having watched this exact dynamic play out before. She signs it, she folds the top copy into an envelope for William, she tears off the carbon duplicate, the pink underside sheet with the pressed impression of every word she just wrote, and she puts it, as she always does, into a locked drawer in the study, where Margaret Doyle, her private secretary of nearly 2 decades, files it under the date. That should have been the entire story. A private caution, quietly delivered, quietly filed. Except the envelope Anne sent didn't stay private for very long, because the man managing the household's transition briefings, the one responsible for logging and circulating correspondence that touches William's planning work, is a former civil servant named Sir Rowan Keene. Sources describe him as capable, organized, the kind of aide who can make a chaotic paper flow look effortless. Exactly the sort of person you'd want managing something as unglamorous and essential as a briefing calendar. He'd been brought into the transition office specifically because of that reputation, and within a matter of months he'd made himself close to indispensable, the one person who always knew which document needed to be where and when. That is exactly the kind of trust that gets tested. Reportedly, when Anne's letter reached the household's correspondence office for logging, as most formal royal correspondence does before it's filed, Keene read it, and somewhere in reading it, he apparently decided that Anne's private warning about the danger of any single advisor being trusted with too much unchecked authority could be quietly rewritten into something else entirely. Not a caution, a mandate. Sources describe him typing a short addition on the household's own transition office typewriter, a single paragraph appended beneath what Anne had actually written, stating in effect that, given the concerns she'd raised, all of William's briefing papers should now be routed through Keene's office before reaching William directly. If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe now, because This is exactly the kind of story we cover here on Royal Motive, the moment when what someone claims and what they actually did stop matching, and a member of this family steps in to close the gap in person. Because that's precisely what happened next. Keene didn't just file the altered version quietly, he circulated it. A printed circular went out to the senior household staff managing William's transition planning, stating that per Princess Anne's note, all briefing materials would now pass through Sir Rowan Keene's office for review before reaching the prince directly. Overnight, a man who had been a capable administrator became, on paper, the gatekeeper standing between William and his own briefings, using Anne's name and Anne's authority as the justification. This is the kind of thing this family has a wound about, and it's not an old wound from 100 years ago. It's recent enough that the household still talks about it in careful, clipped sentences. A few years back, a senior aide close to Charles, trusted for years, was found to have used his closeness and his access for his own benefit, trading on relationships nobody outside the household even knew he had, until it all became public and he had to resign, quietly, with the kind of silence that tells you exactly how serious it was. Sources describe that episode as the reason the household has spent years since then trying to build small structural checks, countersignatures, paper trails, the unglamorous plumbing of an institution trying not to repeat its own mistake. What makes Keene's move so bold and so foolish is that he built his entire claim to authority on the memory of a lesson this family had already learned the hard way once. The two sides of this were set the moment that circular went out, even though neither of them knew it yet. On one side, you have Anne, not a woman who raises her voice easily and not by nature someone who goes looking for confrontation, but she is without question someone who checks her own paper trail and who has never once, in nearly 60 years of public life, let another person's version of events stand unchallenged when she has the original sitting in a locked drawer. She's the keeper here, not just of a private letter, but of the plain, unglamorous idea that a warning is not the same thing as a command, and that nobody gets to blur that line just because it's convenient. On the other side, you have Keene, not a cartoon villain, just a man who had spent months making himself essential, and who apparently convinced himself somewhere along the way that being trusted with the paperwork meant he was entitled to write a little of it himself when it suited him. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from Anne at all. It came from Margaret Doyle back at Gatcombe, the woman who had filed Anne's original carbon duplicate under the date it was written and knew better than almost anyone exactly what that letter said. Reportedly, a colleague in William's office mentioned, in passing, the new arrangement putting Keene's office in charge of routing William's briefings, citing Anne's letter as the reason. Margaret, sources describe, went very still for a moment because she remembered exactly what that letter actually said, and it wasn't that. She didn't call Keene, she didn't ask William's office to clarify, she went straight to the locked drawer, pulled the carbon duplicate, and read it again, slowly, at the same desk where Anne had written it. Then she picked up the telephone and called William's private secretary directly. That's not a small decision. Margaret Doyle had worked quietly and carefully inside this household for nearly 20 years. Exactly the kind of long, unglamorous service that never makes headlines. Reportedly, she sat with the carbon copy in her hands for a long moment before she made that call, because she understood precisely what it would mean once she did. There would be no putting it back in the drawer after that. By the time the call reached William's office, sources describe his private secretary reading the circulated version side by side with what Margaret described over the phone, twice, before saying anything at all. The instruction that came back was simple: get the original. That's where the real dispute begins. William's office contacts Keene directly, formally, and asks a single question: where is the written approval behind the paragraph placing his office in charge of routing William's briefings? No accusation yet, just a request for paperwork, the kind that, if everything were as innocent as it looked, should have been easy to answer. And here's where Keene, reportedly, makes the move that turns a quiet discrepancy into a genuine reckoning. He doesn't back down, and he doesn't produce anything close to what's being asked. Instead, sources describe him arguing that he was simply translating Anne's intent, that anyone reading her actual warning could see the obvious next step was for his office to take on more oversight, and that he'd merely written down what she surely meant, even if she hadn't put it in those exact words herself. He reaches, reportedly, for the household's briefing seal, the wax and ink stamp used to mark a document as the finalized, authoritative version of any circulated briefing paper, and asked that the record simply be stamped and closed, arguing that reopening it now would only unsettle a transition process that was already running smoothly. Honestly, if that argument had worked, this story ends right there. A little procedural overreach, smoothed over, forgotten by autumn. But William's office doesn't accept intent as a substitute for an actual signature, not when the claim being made is that a member of this family personally handed someone new authority over the prince's own papers. That's not bureaucratic stubbornness. That's exactly the kind of check this family spent years building after the last time an aide's closeness got mistaken for permission. So William's team does something Keene apparently didn't expect. They ask Margaret Doyle to bring the actual carbon duplicate down from Gatcombe, and separately, almost as an afterthought, someone on William's staff requests the transition office's typewriter ribbon log, a boring internal record that tracks, by an independent household clock, exactly when documents were struck on that particular machine. Nobody expected that log to matter. It existed purely as an administrative housekeeping habit, the sort of thing nobody outside an office manager ever thinks about, until it decided everything. The log shows the disputed paragraph. The one placing Keene's office in charge of William's briefings was typed on a Thursday evening. Anne's carbon duplicate, dated and filed by Margaret Doyle at Gatcombe, was written and locked away 2 full days earlier. And the household's own internal correspondence record shows that Anne's private office at Gatcombe had already closed for the day, its lines down, well before that Thursday evening paragraph was ever struck. Let that sit for a second. The paragraph claiming Anne's authority was written at a time when it was physically impossible for Anne to have dictated a single word of it to anyone. That's not a rushed clerical shortcut. That's a man adding his own sentence to someone else's letter and hoping the timeline would never be checked closely enough to notice. The sentence that would not stay borrowed had already given Keene away in a boring administrative ribbon log nobody thought to hide, and he didn't even know it yet. Word moves quickly once the timestamp is confirmed against the office's independent internal clock, the kind of cross-check specifically built so that a single altered record can't be quietly patched after the fact. The household board doesn't wait for a full formal report. They pull Keene's authority to sign or circulate anything under the transition office's letterhead, pending review, and they schedule a meeting. Not a hearing, a briefing, the same kind Keene had spent months managing, except this time he's not the one controlling what's on the agenda. And here's the part that's easy to miss if you're only half following along. This stops being about one disputed paragraph almost immediately, once William's team starts pulling Keene's other circulated documents against the actual approvals behind them. Sources describe a pattern, small additions here and there over recent months, phrases quietly inserted into minor briefing notes that expanded just slightly the scope of what Keene's office was authorized to review. Nothing as bold as claiming Anne's name outright, not until this, but a pattern nonetheless of a man who had learned exactly how much extra authority he could write into a document before anyone thought to check the original. To be fair, there's a more forgiving version of this story, where it's simply an overcommitted aide paraphrasing badly under pressure, genuinely believing he was helping. That's a real possibility, and for about a day, it's the version some people inside the transition office wanted to believe because the alternative meant admitting they'd handed real authority to a man who'd quietly written it for himself. But the ribbon log closes that door. You can forgive a poorly worded summary. You cannot explain away a paragraph time-stamped 2 evenings after the person it claims to quote had already locked her office for the day. So the carbon copy itself, the object this whole story keeps circling back to, gets carried out of Gatcombe's locked drawer and into the household's briefing room for the conversation that has to happen next. The reversal happens on a grey, close afternoon, the kind of heavy English summer weather where the air feels thick before a storm actually breaks. The briefing room itself is nothing grand, a long table, tall windows looking out over wet gravel, the household's usual working space, rather than any ceremonial setting. Sources describe it deliberately chosen that way, because this was never meant to be theatre. It was meant to be a settling of accounts, on the same table where Keene had run a dozen ordinary briefings without a second thought. William is there, so is the senior household staff who'd received Keene's circular in the first place. Margaret Doyle sits near the door, the carbon duplicate in a plain folder in her lap, the same folder she's carried documents in for 20 years. And then Anne arrives, carrying the folder herself for the last few steps into the room, and asks quietly that, before anything else is discussed, Sir Rowan Keene read the final handwritten sentence of her original note aloud to the room. Keene reportedly hesitates. He has the circulated version in front of him, the one with his own added paragraph at the bottom, He begins reading and reaches the end of what Anne actually wrote, and then keeps going into the sentence he added himself, the one directing all of William's briefings through his office. Nobody has to say anything yet. The room simply listens to a sentence Anne never wrote, read aloud in her name. Then Anne opens the folder, lifts out the carbon duplicate, and lays it directly on top of Keene's circulated page on the table in front of everyone. The carbon impression pressed into the paper the same evening Anne wrote it ends cleanly mid-page, exactly where Keene's added paragraph begins on his version. There is simply nothing there, no impression, no trace, because it was never written by the hand that pressed everything above it. Sources describe Keene going very quiet, reaching for the same argument about translating her intent and stopping himself partway through the sentence because he can see as clearly as everyone else in the room that intent doesn't leave an impression on carbon paper, only actual handwriting does. Advice is not an appointment. That's not etiquette. That's not a formality. That's a man's entire claim to expanded authority, collapsing the moment two pieces of paper are placed one on top of the other. The price is named immediately in the same room before the meeting even formally continues. Keene is stripped of the transition chair on the spot. The household board asks for the briefing seal, the same instrument he'd tried to use days earlier to stamp the dispute closed, and instructs him to use it one final time, not on a briefing, but on his own written notice of removal, so that the last official act performed with that seal under his authority is the act that ends his authority completely. Reportedly, Keene's hand shakes slightly as he presses it down. Nobody in the room says anything unkind. Nobody needs to. He hands the seal to a member of the household board, along with every key and access card tied to William's papers, and leaves the room holding nothing but his own altered copy, the version that started this entire reckoning and now proves nothing at all. He doesn't get a quiet reassignment somewhere else in the household. He doesn't get to finish out the transition project he'd spent months building his position around. Every future draft of William's briefing calendar from that afternoon onward is compiled without him. And here's the detail that turns this from a dismissal into a genuine structural reckoning. The household board doesn't stop at removing Keene. They use the ribbon log discovery to rewrite how any correspondence circulated in a royal's name gets verified going forward. From now on, no document claiming to relay instructions from Anne or from any senior royal can be circulated without her own direct countersignature, checked against an independently time-stamped record. One advisor's convenient paraphrase is no longer enough, no matter how trusted he's been, no matter how smoothly he'd run things before. That's the shareable scene right there, if you want one image to hold onto from this whole story. Not just the confrontation itself, vivid as it is, it's the sight of the briefing seal sitting afterward in a locked drawer at the household office, released now only against a signed, dated countersignature from the person it claims to represent. Some sentences remember exactly who wrote them. Now, you might expect Charles to have something to say about all this, an advisor dismissed, his son's briefing process upended, a scandal touching the household's inner workings. But sources describe Charles saying essentially nothing publicly about Keene's removal, offering no defense of the advisor, no comment on the transition office's restructuring, nothing at all. Reportedly, when told the outcome, he simply nodded and returned to the paperwork already in front of him, the way a man does when he already knows there's nothing worth arguing. And honestly, that silence says plenty on its own. It means nobody upstairs was willing to suggest Anne or William had gotten this wrong. Let's talk about what this actually cost Keene, because it's worth being precise about it. He didn't just lose a title, he lost the entire professional identity he'd spent months constructing, the reputation as the man who made an unglamorous, high-stakes paper flow look effortless. He lost it in a single afternoon in front of the exact colleagues who'd trusted him to manage it. He lost any chance of walking into his next role with a reference that didn't require an uncomfortable explanation, and he lost it because of a habit Anne had kept quietly, without fanfare for nearly 60 years, the simple discipline of never letting a private word become someone else's unwitnessed claim. That's the direct price, not a reprimand, not a quiet transfer somewhere out of sight. A complete, irreversible collapse of everything he'd built, paid entirely by the one person who caused it. Advice is not an appointment. Keene wrote himself one anyway, and it cost him the pen. Here's what I keep coming back to, honestly. This story didn't need a succession crisis or a marriage scandal to matter. It needed one handwritten warning, one added paragraph, and one private secretary who noticed a circular didn't match the letter she'd filed herself and had the nerve to make a phone call about it. Everything after that was just the paperwork doing what paperwork eventually always does. And that's the pattern worth sitting with, the way it keeps showing up in this family in different shapes. The people who assume that being trusted with someone else's words means they're entitled to add a few of their own are usually the ones who get caught by exactly the small, boring record they never thought anyone would check. Anne didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need a public statement or a legal team. She needed a locked drawer, a carbon duplicate she'd kept out of habit for decades, and about 10 seconds of silence in a briefing room while a man read a sentence he'd written and called it hers. What most coverage of this family misses is how much of the real authority sits in exactly these unglamorous places, not the grand ceremonial ones. Nobody was watching a typewriter ribbon log at a household transition office. Nobody thought a single added paragraph mattered enough to end a career, but that's precisely where it happened. On an ordinary grey afternoon, over a table, with a folder Margaret Doyle had carried for 20 years and a pad of carbon paper that finally did exactly what Anne had always kept it for. It's worth saying, too, that the new countersignature rule doesn't stay confined to this one office. Reportedly, William's household is already extending the same requirement to every senior royals correspondence handled anywhere near the transition planning process, treating Keene's paragraph not as an isolated lapse, but as the reason the whole system needed tightening before it happened to someone else. That's the quiet legacy sitting underneath the personal one. Keene didn't just lose his own chair,